open to question. I remember when I was 12 years old, I was at a mosque, and I asked an imam a question about the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad. And I was told that if I asked that question again, I would burn in the fires of hell. I was 12 years old. That moment actually became one of the most important experiences of my life, because I realized that any theological position which couldn't be challenged was not worthy of following. It just was not worthy. If you can't ask a question, then that's wrong. But here's the point. I got the impression from Rob Bell that his upbringing didn't encourage the kind of intellectual questioning that you encourage on your radio show, and that I'm sure many people in the modern setting accept as being absolutely essential to pursuing one's own personal pilgrimage and faith. That's absolutely essential. I don't think Rob Bell had a chance to do that. And to my, I think in looking at the text, in many ways, he's ventilating the painful experience, and I'm sympathetic to that.
I want our audience to hear the question as you posed it to Rob Bell. Here is Martin Bashir at the end of the interview with Rob Bell on Tuesday. I think in a question form, perfectly summarizing exactly what motivates, what makes the emergent generation tick, especially as it's represented by Rob Bell.
How much is this book you working out your own childhood experience of being brought up in a fairly cramped evangelical family and really finding that difficult as you became an adult? How much is this actually that?
I think, Martin, you put your finger on exactly what many of us feel is the driving force behind the so-called emergent church, and that is a group of young men who are sort of producing a reaction to their upbringing in a very strict fundamentalist Christian environment, and I like to say now the junior high youth pastors are actually pastoring the church, and bring your soda pop and your jeans into the building, and let's have a popcorn fight and a pillow fight. And it seems to me that's where Rob Bell is coming from. It's sort of a reaction, and I'm wondering how you came to put your finger on that.
Well, you just saying that, I won't be so discourteous as to ask your age, but if you're over the age of 30, you will be condemned as a Luddite, as a Jurassic Park remnant for raising that issue, because you will be accused of not being allowed, or you won't be accused, you'll be told your view is irrelevant. And that's one of the problems with this whole issue, because what happens is when the discussion starts, it becomes a closed discussion, because everybody who's ever lived in the past, who's ever had a theological training that might be orthodox, that might be mainstream, forget it. That's out the window, because now what we're focused on are some really subtle, nuanced, carefully conceived ways of discussing Christianity. And only this generation get it. And that's why Rob Bell's book is number 4 on Amazon.com. And that's why it is selling like hotcakes. That's why his financial advance was substantial. That's why he is, in inverted commas, a huge success. Because there are a lot of people who have closed off a sector for the discussion and said, this we can only speak into. The rest, ignore them. So that's the first danger. And it's problematic for a number of reasons, not least. If you think about it, history informs the present. We can't take the view that because there have been nuclear meltdowns in the past, we're going to completely ignore what happened in those circumstances as we deal with the Fukushima plant in Japan now. That would be idiotic, and nobody would accept that. And yet, that's exactly what's happening now, where many people are deemed to be gray-haired, old-fashioned, and ignorant, and out of touch. But the reality is that the reason why this fracture is occurring, I think, is because a lot of those people from previous generations, if you like, are raising difficult questions for this particular group of people. And the other thing to bear in mind is, if the church in the past has been so backward, inward-looking, unconnected to culture, how has it survived? a question that I wanted to put to Rob Bell, because, look, I've got 3 children. My son is 22, my daughter's 20, I have a youngest who was 15 yesterday, Eliza. I can do a lot of things to try and impress them. But if I start rapping like a rapper or dressing like a 15-year-old, that's going to be problematic for them.
Yes.
And they're going to find that difficult. But that does not mean that my parental responsibility ceases, or that they will never listen to me because I don't dress like them and speak like them. And that's the point. What I'm trying to get at in that argument that I was having with Rob Bell was that you have to think about what the purpose of this is. And if your destination and your purpose, if your aim and goal is to deliver a Christian message that is more easily digested for the contemporary world, then you must accept that what you're dispensing is a Christianity that is not comprehensive and fulsome in the way that it's been presented by others. And the problem, I think, for Rob Bell is if he were to say that, his whole constituency would run for cover, because they would look at that and say, hang on a second, is this guy really in the center of mainstream faith issues, or is he not? And so I think the reason for the obfuscation, the doubt, the one foot in one camp, one foot in the other, is because he's politically strategic enough to realize that if he comes out with a position that is categoric, it might damage his popularity. And then where do you go? You don't sell your books. You don't pay back the publisher's advance. So I think that that's really what the issue here is.
What was Rob Bell's demeanor when the interview ended?
We shook hands. I thanked him very much during the commercial break. He seemed discomforted, slightly surprised, I would say. But I didn't get an opportunity to speak to him at length afterwards. There's been some nonsense online suggesting that I refused to shake his hand and all this sort of stuff. And, of course, deliberately so, because people want now to paint me as the evil, you can't attack the message, attack the messenger. But actually, it was a very courteous end to an interview. I would have loved the opportunity to have sat down with him for an hour, because I think that it would have been even more illustrative of some of the issues that I've been raising in this conversation with you. I don't think this matter is by any means resolved. And the other thing I've been very interested to note has been the explosion of interest and the expression of many sentiments proves that there is a large cohort of people who up until now have almost been biting their tongue, have almost been concerned to be civil, to be respectful, to not have a blazing row, as it were, in front of the children. And I think that what's happened is that interview has somehow broken that dam. Mm-hmm. And I think the discussion now has become more open. And so it should, because these are very, very important issues for all of us. And if we're not going to have an open discussion about them, then that would be completely wrong and something that we should oppose. On the other hand, and I hope that I wanted to be courteous and respectful, and I have nothing but a civil attitude to Mr. Bell. I think that he's, in many ways, as I've said earlier, the victim of his own experience, as to some extent we all are. And I think that this book, in many ways, was the outworking of that. And, the other thing I would say about him as well, I do think that he wants to extend what he says in his book is the overwhelming love of God to people. I do think that's his motive. I do think that he recognizes, because, as he says, in his book, the title of his book is Love Wins. That's what he wants to dispense to people. That's really at the heart of his message. And I think, he should be credited for wanting to do such a positive thing. The question is whether, in so doing, he's actually failing to observe some proper fundamentals of history and also some proper fundamentals of biblical criticism. Mm-hmm. And, in so doing, that's what I was trying to raise as an issue.
Did Harper 1 or